You've been doing it for so long you assumed it was universal. The constant internal narration. The parallel conversations running beneath whatever's happening in the room. The fully rendered simulations of things that haven't happened yet. Arguments rehearsed 100 times. Dialogues you've lived entirely in your head before they ever occurred in reality. And then one day, maybe recently, someone said something that made you stop. Not everyone's mind works like this. Not everyone has a city behind their eyes that's louder, more detailed, and more alive than the room they're standing in. This video isn't going to tell you you're rare. It isn't going to call you a genius. It's going to explain something that probably no one has ever explained to you. Why you built a world inside your head, and what that world has been doing to the one outside it. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network. Identified by Buckner, Andrews Hanna, and colleagues in the early 2000s, it baffled researchers for years because it activated precisely when the brain appeared to be doing nothing useful, when attention drifted, when you stared at a wall. They called it the resting state. They were wrong. The default mode network doesn't rest. It constructs. It runs simulations of scenarios that haven't happened. It revisits memories to extract meaning they didn't surrender the first time. It models other minds, testing what someone might feel, what they might want, what they might do. It takes the raw, unprocessed data of being alive and quietly, continuously, turns it into something coherent. In some people, this network is significantly more active and more interconnected than average. Not as a disorder, not as a diagnosis, as an architecture. The result is a primary processing system built for internal operation, where the external world supplies the data and the real work happens somewhere no one can observe. What looks like absence is the deepest processing mode the brain has. So when you sit with a question for hours, not because you're stuck, but because your mind is genuinely modeling every possible answer before committing to one, that's the DMN at full capacity. When you argue both sides of a problem before speaking, you're not indecisive, you're running a simulation, testing the weight of a position before exposing it. When you study your own emotions, the way someone else might study weather data, observing patterns, tracing origins, noting when the pressure drops before the storm, that's metacognition, layered on top of a hyperactive DMN. The network doesn't just process, it processes its own processing. This is why the curiosity often has no practical target. You don't spend an hour reading about deep ocean geology because it's useful. You do it because the DMN, in its default mode, is in pure exploratory configuration, gathering, connecting, building internal models of how everything relates, whether or not those models will ever be deployed. And this is why solitude doesn't feel empty. The DMN is why your own mind feels like sufficient company. You've built an ecosystem detailed enough to inhabit without external input. The silence isn't absence of stimulation, it's the preferred condition for the system to operate at full depth. But here's what the world doesn't see. This system never clocks out. The brain running it is mentally employed, permanently, 24 hours a day, with no salary and no visible output. The labor is real, the visibility is zero, and it accumulates. The internal conversation, when this network is dominant, has higher resolution than most external ones, not because you're above the people around you, but because you've spent years running every exchange at a depth most conversations don't operate in real time. When someone says something simple across from you, your mind has already processed 3 layers of what they might mean, what you'd want to say, and whether saying it would survive the translation. If you've ever felt like conversations were somehow simplified, like you were operating at a register the exchange couldn't quite reach, that's not arrogance. That's the gap between internal resolution and external bandwidth. If this is starting to feel uncomfortably accurate, subscribe to Quiet Psychology, because what we haven't reached yet goes considerably deeper. The first cost is one most people with a dominant inner world recognize: but rarely name. When your interior runs at high resolution, the exterior starts to look flat. Not because there's something wrong with the exterior, but because every social interaction requires translation. You take what's happening inside, layered, multidirectional, operating at a speed the room doesn't run at, and compress it into something expressible, something the moment can hold, something that doesn't require the other person to pause everything to keep up. That translation is exhausting. Not performatively exhausting, structurally exhausting. You stopped trying to look smart a long time ago, not out of humility, because the energy required to bridge the gap between what you think and what's socially sayable costs more than the exchange usually gives back. So you stop translating as much, not as a decision, as conservation, and the world reads that silence as distance. The bridges between your interior and the people outside it don't collapse. They just get used less, and they narrow by disuse. But here's where it gets complicated. There's a spectrum. At one end, the inner world as a workshop. You enter, you build, you process, and you return, enriched. The interior is an instrument. At the other end, the inner world as a bunker. You enter because the exterior stopped being safe, responsive, or rich enough. The interior becomes the only space where your mind can operate without being interrupted, corrected, or made smaller. The workshop is a choice. The bunker is an adaptation. And most people have never stopped long enough to ask which one they're actually living in. Eli Sommer, a psychologist who identified maladaptive daydreaming in 2002, mapped what happens when the inner world stops supplementing reality and begins competing with it. It isn't pathology in the clinical sense, it's a point on the spectrum. The line between a rich inner life and living more there than here isn't always visible from the inside. And now this next part might be uncomfortable to hear. What if living inside your head isn't intelligence? What if it started as survival? At some point, maybe before you had language for it, the world outside didn't respond the way your mind needed. It interrupted, it simplified, it corrected. So your mind built a place where it could operate without interference. A room with no intrusions. A world that responded at the speed of thought. And that world worked. So completely that now you can't always tell the difference between choosing to be there and not knowing how to leave. The workshop became the bunker. The bunker became the city. And the city became so familiar, so entirely yours, that the outside world started to feel like someone else's house. Do you live inside your head because you chose to, or because at some point it was the only place that felt like yours? There's a way to find out. It doesn't require a diagnosis or a decade of therapy. It's one question, asked honestly. When you surface from your inner world, after a long stretch alone with your thoughts, after a walk where no one spoke to you, do you return enriched or relieved? Enriched means the interior was a workshop. You went in, built something, and came out with more than you had. Relieved means it was shelter. You went in to get away from something. Both are real, but only one of them tells you the truth about where you've been living, and why. There's an image that stays with me. An older person, quiet, internal, sitting alone at dusk, not restless, not visibly lonely, just settled into a depth that asks nothing of the room. Maybe you've known someone like this. Maybe you carry it as something inherited, a kind of pensive solitude passed quietly through generations, a way of moving through the world that built its richest life somewhere no one else could access. That person wasn't missing. That person had built something. The question is whether the building ever had windows. If you love someone who seems permanently somewhere else, understand that what looks like absence is often the most intense presence they're capable of. They're not ignoring the world. They're processing it at a depth most people don't reach. The bridge isn't built by pulling them out. It's built by understanding they were never empty, just somewhere you couldn't follow. And if you are that person, If you've spent your whole life being told you're not quite there, consider this. You were never somewhere else. You were somewhere deeper. The question isn't how to leave. It's whether you've been living there by design or by necessity. That distinction changes everything. And recognizing it is already the beginning of the answer. There's a city inside you that no one has ever visited. Streets only you walk. Buildings filled with thoughts no one has read. Libraries of conversations you've had with yourself. Indexed, revisited, quietly revised across years. The city is vast, detailed, functional, more real, in many moments, than most rooms you've stood in. But at some point, the bridges started to thin, not by destruction, by disuse. The connections between your city and the outside world grew narrower, not because you chose isolation, but because the city kept expanding and the bridges stopped keeping up. A city with no bridges isn't a sanctuary. It's an island. The work, the real work, isn't building a smaller city. It isn't making yourself less interior, less layered, less you. It's rebuilding the bridges. Not to let the world in, to let yourself out. Because the world didn't need another quiet person, pretending to be simpler than they are. It needed the person who built an entire city, inside a silence no one else could hear.